How does it feel to be back on book tour during the pandemic? David Sedaris returns to the podcast to talk about his collected diaries, A Carnival of Snackery. And what's it like to collaborate with Paul McCartney? Paul Muldoon joins us to talk about working on the lyrics and reads to us from his own new collection of poetry, Howdy Skelp. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. And one quick programming note, we'll be off for New Year's Eve next week, but back with you again January 7th. Until then, Happy New Year. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's December 24th. I'm Pamela Paul. David Sedaris joins us now from Montana, where he is on tour for his latest book, A Carnival of Snackery, Diaries 2003 to 2020. David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Pamela.
So this is your second volume of diaries. Your first one, Theft by Finding, was 1997 to 2002. And you mentioned that your partner, Hugh, called Volume 1 the David Copperfield Sedaris. Does he have a name for this one?
No, he doesn't. That just occurred to me that he didn't come up with a name for this one. But no, I mean, the first one had more of an arc. Perhaps there's one to this, but I can't see it. I mean, my life really changed from 1977 to 2002. And from 2003 to 2020, I mean, I definitely got older. But I don't know that my circumstances changed the way that they did in the first volume.
Well, I think most people probably have a sense of how your circumstances changed during those years. But for those who have not made their way through that first volume of diaries, how would you describe that arc?
Well, and when I started keeping a diary in 1977, I was 20 years old. You know, I had a job as a dishwasher, and I was living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Then I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I worked on and off. I don't think I've ever in my life had a real job. Well, maybe for a bit. I taught for a couple of years at the Art Institute, but other than that, I always worked under the table for this person or that. And I would wait until somebody came to me and said, "Do you need a job?" Like, I'm completely incapable of going out and asking for one, asking anybody for anything. I'm not proud. I can't give you a single reason why you should hire me or why you should read my book. I honestly can't. I can recommend 10 other people who you should hire or whose books you should read, but I'm just never been very good at selling myself.
You seem to have done okay.
Well, maybe it's the anti-salesmanship that helps. I mean, I would imagine quite often if you go to a dinner party or something and people find out what it is that you do, then they think, okay, how can this person help me? And it would be, I don't know, it would be really tiresome. And so I think it's better just to present yourself as a pathetic person and then have people think, what can I do for this person? I met someone a couple of weeks ago at a book signing, and we only spoke to each other for a few minutes, but I thought, okay, what can I do for this person? How can I help this person? He didn't ask me for anything. I just said, when was the last time you cried? And his answer was like really good.
10 minutes ago?
No, he had cried earlier that week. The reason why he cried, I don't know, it just broke my heart. And then it turned out he was going to start a job the next day. Anyway, and so I was talking to him, and then I was talking to him sort of loudly at the table so other people could hear. And this woman 3 places down said, "I'll pay you more than that if you start working for me tomorrow. I'll pay you $20 an hour." You know, and the other job was going to pay him like $13 an hour. So, but he was just that kind of person. It was just something that came off of him that you thought, here, let me protect you. Let me take care of that for you. I don't know. That seems the best way to get ahead is to be that person. And I don't know that it can be studied. I think it just has to be inside of you, this sort of patheticness. Not a total patheticness, because then if someone said, okay, I'm going to give you this job and you show up tomorrow, if there's total patheticness, you wouldn't show up for the job. So there has to be a little something else there.
So for a lot of people, and certainly speaking for myself, the idea of going through old diaries is excruciating to encounter one's former self. And I guess it really depends on the diaries themselves and perhaps the person. But what's it like for you going through your old diaries? Is it pure pleasure? Does it ever make you feel like, oh God, this guy, or what was I thinking?
Well, for the first volume, it was sort of excruciating, but because a lot of that I just started writing. But for the second volume, I'd been writing for a good long time. So the writing didn't embarrass me. And I don't write about my feelings. So I didn't have that to be embarrassed about. And since I started writing on the computer, which was in 2000, I started I print it out at the end of every season, but I compose it on the laptop. So I start every morning by going to what I wrote exactly 1 week earlier and cleaning it up. Right. So if I see that I've got 3 sentences in a row that start with the word he, I just clean it up a little. I don't spend, an inordinate amount of time on it. It's like sort of what an editor would do, just make it more readable and just tidy it up. So the writing itself didn't bother me. But of course, I definitely got sick of myself. I mean, it was a lot to read because every day I might write like 2 to 3 pages. But then I'm in Helena, Montana, and I got here last night and I'm at this hotel and I thought, I wonder what room I had the last time I was here. So I looked it up in my diary from 2015 and I found this diary entry about getting a haircut in Helena, Montana. It was a female barber and she was reading this book about time travel. And she asked me if I could go back in time. When would I go back to? She said she would go to the Old West. And I was thinking more that I would go back to like Paris in the 20s just so I could buy a lot of artwork. Anyway, and her husband was there and he was just glaring at me the whole time. It was one of those situations and you think, am I on a wanted poster or something? Like, what did I do? Like, why does this person hate me so much? And I thought, gosh, why didn't I put that diary entry in the book? I really liked it. Maybe I just had too many about haircuts.
It's funny when you say you don't write about your feelings. Is that a deliberate choice or you don't like writing about your feelings? Why not?
I'm not that interested in my feelings. And I'm not interested in anybody's feelings, really. When somebody uses that word in a sentence, well, I've been feeling really exterior lately, or I've been feeling really vulnerable. I don't care. I like to hear a story. I sort of turn off when people talk about their feelings. I mean, if somebody says they're angry at me, I don't mean that I turn off there. I listen to that, but just that sort of wishy-washiness of feelings. Like, I really liked Carrie Fisher, right? I thought Carrie Fisher was really funny, and I enjoyed
Brilliant
her
writer.
books. Yeah, I thought so too. And then she had that book where it was the Princess Diaries, and she had her diaries from when she was working on Star Wars. And it's not her fault. She was young, right? But those were diaries. They were all about her feelings. And it was interesting to see how far she'd come, to see her writing from when she was a young woman to how she was writing toward the end of her life. It was interesting to look at it and say, wow, that's really a quantum leap there. But I just had to skim through the parts that were about her feelings. It was just the dullest stuff in the world. And I was surprised that she put it in the book.
I guess most people's diaries are probably 98% feelings, and maybe that's what makes them largely unreadable to people other than the diarist.
Well, I think the word diary connotes feelings. I don't think the word journal connotes feelings so much as diary, but I wouldn't say that I keep a journal. I would say that I keep a diary.
You do have a few recurrent themes in this book. One of them is mice, for example, and another one, I feel like you're going to transition maybe to rats in the next one. But the other one, obvious one, is travel. And having just spent a weekend traveling, it does feel like really good material for observation. What is it that makes travel so ripe for humor? Are people just more people-like, only worse when they're set in motion?
For me, one of the things that makes it ripe is the up and down of it. And it's always up and down. Like right now I'm on a lecture tour, right? So I'm going to 70 cities. So one night you're at, the brand new Four Seasons in Philadelphia. And the next night you're at a 4 Points Sheraton in York, Pennsylvania, right? And the interesting thing is, like, I like really, really nice hotels, but I hate people who stay in them. But I don't think you can stay in a really nice hotel and think I'm different than these people. You're not. You just can't see it. So you're horrible too, but you can't see it. And so there's always an up and down just in terms of your accommodations. But now there's an up and down with mandates as well. I was in Los Angeles a couple of days ago, and there was a sign on the door saying to wear a mask. And everyone wore a mask. And you had to show your vaccination card to get into the hotel restaurant. And then I checked into this hotel last night, and I had a mask on. And I was greeted the way I would if I were wearing a Hillary Clinton T-shirt to a Klan rally. This is definitely not a heavy mask area. I left Los Angeles and I went to Palm Springs, and there, nobody in the hotel had a mask on. I mean, the people who worked there did, but it was a fancy hotel. None of the guests did. It said, if you have been vaccinated, we invite you to wander around without a mask on. So then you thought, well, if I wear a mask, people are going to think I'm unvaccinated.
Right.
So every day is different in terms of that, and it's not just state to state, it's cities within a state as well. And you never know what's in front of you.
One of the things about travel, air travel in particular, that's so different from everyday life is that in America, of course, we like to pretend that we don't have classes, but in air travel, it's very blatant that there are first class people, and then there are business class people who are almost first class, and then there's the chattel class. And you're now in first class, but I wonder if you in part feel inside your coach class.
I mean, at first you feel guilty about being in first class, I used to walk when I would board a plane, I would look at the people in first class and think, you expect to find Nicole Kidman in first class, right? And instead it's somebody who sells air conditioning systems, right? That's who it is instead. And then when they started putting me in first class, I would kind of hide my face because I felt like I was disappointing people, because they would go down expecting Rob Lowe, and instead it's this guy. They don't even know who he is. But all it takes is a couple of years, and then you think, well, of course I'm in first class. But then when the pandemic hit, my first thought was, what about my executive platinum status on American Airlines? That was my first thought. Not people who are dying, but if my tours are canceled and if I can't fly, am I going to be in boarding group D? Because I would kill myself if it was boarding group 5.
Yeah, no, it's boarding group 6 or 7 on American Airlines.
Right. And you can only bring like a little lunch pail on if you're in that boarding group.
Another thing that struck me in this book, you had a really beautiful, moving piece in The New Yorker recently about the recent death of your father. And it's full of affection. And you read it recently at one of your events on tour. In the book, though, you revisit some really difficult moments with him. There's a kind of much fuller picture of him as less a kind of character, but also some tough things like his adamant opposition to gay marriage. What was that like revisiting those moments? Because he kind of changed towards the end.
Toward the very end of his life, my father developed dementia and forgot that he was a horrible person. And it was amazing. Like the last time I saw him was really the one time in my entire life that I spent time with him that he didn't say something awful or spend our entire time criticizing me or do or say something to undermine me. He forgot he was that guy, and he was lovely. But for 97 years before that, he was really difficult to be around. I knew who he was. I've known who he was for a long time. So I think what would hurt was that he was still trying, right? Like, for instance, I would go home to do a show, and I would be in this 2,300 seat theater, and afterwards, my father would say, "You told me the show was sold out." I counted 27 empty seats. It's not sold out. And I would say, well, people buy their tickets months in advance, and often they forget that they were supposed to come to the theater tonight. That's not what happened. That seat was empty. Well, why would you even say that to somebody? Like if I had said, my show's sold out, sorry, you can't come, it's sold out, my show's been sold out for months, then I can see trying to bring that guy down. But I never said anything about it. But just the very fact that he would be sitting in the audience doing that, counting the empty seats so he could confront me about it afterwards. I grew up with that person. But so what he said didn't bother me. It was just that he was still trying, right? Still trying to, hurt me, essentially. And he kept it up until the very end when he started going to the front desk at his assisted living center, asking if they'd seen his parents and calling us and asking if we had seen his mom. And he became this really friendly person.
Yeah, very charming in that last essay.
Yeah, he was. It was like a gift. It's as if he said, let me give you one last essay, and it's going to be the best thing you've ever written. Be patient. Just be patient with me and I'll give it to you. And that's what he did. Well, that's what I did.
You obviously had to stop touring during quarantine. And as you mentioned, you're now back on a 70-city tour. What's it like touring when there's a raging pandemic going on? Is it weird having an audience of masked people?
Well, it's harder to hear people during question and answer, because they have masks on. But I've been surprised by what people are willing to. They're like, you want us to show proof of vaccination? Okay, we'll do it. You want us to wear a mask the entire time? Okay, we'll do it. And then the book signings have lasted as long as they always did. So people are still willing to wait in line. And I'm really been touched by that. And I'm willing to do, make whatever sacrifices I need to in order to be, it's hard to sign books with a mask on and I'm behind a plexiglass shield, and I'd prefer not to have the mask and just the shield. And sometimes I can get away with that. And sometimes the theater's like, nope, you have to have that mask all the way up. And it's a drag because it makes it harder to hear people and harder to talk to people. But if that's what I have to do, I'll do it. I'm just so grateful to be out again. I'm just so grateful to be. I went to a concert at the 92nd Street Y in July. I saw Kurt Elling. And he and his band were exuberant, and the audience was exuberant. We're so glad to be out again. And even if we did have to have masks on and show our vaccination proof, whatever, it was a semblance of normalcy. And we were all so grateful for it. And I loved the feeling in the room. I just loved that. I've never been in a room that felt like that. So much pent up joy in a room. And I sense that a lot. And I'm not saying it has anything to do with me. It's just people saying, okay, this is almost what it looked like 3 years ago. Our faces are covered. But I mean, if you were to take a photograph, we're here, so the seats are full and we're back. And 10 to 20% of people aren't ready yet. And so the people who bought tickets and so they're staying at home. And that's okay. And that number will hopefully creep back up. And you never know what somebody's story is, if somebody is wearing gloves and a mask and a face shield and all that stuff, you don't know what they've got going on.
So people love listening to you, and you got your start in many ways on public radio. And yet you made the decision with this audiobook, not only to record portions of it yourself, but also to have Tracey Ullman, the brilliant, crazily talented Tracey Ullman, read parts. How did that come about?
Well, a lot of what I included in the diary book was funny to me because of the way that it was said. And so they were things that I heard in England and in Australia and in Ireland. On paper, maybe they didn't seem that funny, but it was the regional accents that I heard that made them funny. And nobody's better at that than Tracey Ullman. So I asked if she would read all of the UK and Australian parts of the book. And she agreed to do it. And it was so much fun working with her. And I didn't tell her what to do. I wandered into the recording studio, and I'd wander in and out and listen to her. But a lot of it I didn't hear until the book was finished. And it was almost as if she had been there. She would say, I know this type of person. Okay, I know this kind of person. And she would exactly. This. She said, oh, riding a horse. Okay, horse person. Yeah, got it. And she would just completely nail it.
Let's listen to a clip of Tracey Ullman reading from the book.
The weather was beautiful yesterday afternoon, bright and clear with a slight chill. I picked up a few things at the supermarket in Storrington and then headed down the lane past the fitness centre, which is narrow and winding, canopied by tall trees. I'd just started listening to Mark Maron, who was introducing his 2010 interview with Robin Williams, when a dog rounded a bend in the road and approached me, snarling. I don't know what breed it was. I was too busy being scared. Size-wise, it was big, like a German shepherd, but not a German shepherd. 20 or so feet behind the dog was a woman on horseback. She saw what was happening, but didn't pick up her pace or seem particularly concerned. Meanwhile, I slowly backed up. "Bramble," the woman called, and I realised that she and I had run into each other twice before. The first time was near the pub. It was raining buckets, and I'd heard her tell a woman who was racing toward her parked car that she needed to put her umbrella down. "My horse is afraid of umbrellas," she'd called.
There are many things in this book that make me laugh from you, and also the jokes that other people tell you, which is a really good distancing device because it's not your fault that you're telling this joke since someone else told it to you. Very clever. But one of the many parts that I really loved was the little section on dogs. This was 2014 in Rackham.
Moving to another country, you're kind of starting over from scratch in terms of types of people. Like, what does it mean to, in the United States, I know what it means if a person has a certain kind of car, for example, or if a person wears a particular brand of clothing. I'm not saying that everybody's a type, but I mean, I'm a type. Most people can be broken into a type of one sort or another. That doesn't mean that they don't have their own uniqueness, but there's a type of person in England who rides around on a horse, and it's always a woman on her high horse in every sense of the word. And I'm constantly amazed by this person. Just, there's an area near us. I live on the edge of what's essentially Downton Abbey, right? But there's a public right of way. And so you can walk across the grounds of this massive, massive estate on thousands of acres of land. And so I'll often see horse people, and they'll go through the gate. And there's a big sign. It's a deer park as well. So you have to close the gate because the deer, do not let the deer out. That didn't apply to them. They just open the gate and just go through it, and they don't close the door behind them. And I've had these people say to me, put that away, your plastic bag. My horse is frightened of plastic bags. Put it away. And I'm there, cleaning the road. Your horse is afraid of a plastic bag. Maybe your horse should stay home. Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's scared of everything.
All right. We started with mice. We're ending with a horse and a dog. So it feels like we have come, I don't know if it's full circle, but it feels like as likely as any other place to end. The new book, again, is called A Carnival of Snackery. It's by, of course, David Sedaris. David, thank you so much again for being here.
Thanks, Pamela. Thanks so much for having me back again. I appreciate it.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Paul Muldoon joins us now from County Cork in Ireland. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. He has a new collection out now called Howdy Skelp, and he is also the co-editor, co-author of Paul McCartney's books, The Lyrics. So, Paul, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I think what we will do on this podcast in order to simplify matters is I will refer to Paul McCartney as McCartney and you as Paul, and you will not call me Paula, and everything should work out.
Okay.
All right. We'll move forward from there. But before we start, I just want to read one paragraph from Paul McCartney's introduction, his foreword to this book, because it's about you, and you won't probably say it yourself, and then we can go from there. So he writes about why he wanted you to be involved in this project, and he says, "For one, I knew Paul's was a receptive ear. He was not a biographer looking for gossip or secrets, hoping to learn more about some supposed feud between me and John or Yoko. Nor was he an over-the-top fan turned writer, looking to transform every word uttered into some kind of sacred text. What appealed to me immediately was that Muldoon is a poet. Like me, he is into words and understands the poetics of words, how the lyrics themselves become their own form of music that can become even more magical when paired with a melody." I could keep going because he says other nice things, but first let's just start with, what did you think when you read that?
Well, I was thrilled, and of course, I think he recognized immediately, and he says as much there, that I had no particular agenda in being involved in this project. If I did have an agenda, it was a very simple one, and it was to focus on the lyrics per se. It's no accident that the book is called The Lyrics rather than the songs. And we wanted to focus on the texts, the words without the music. And of course, we know from the outset that the words without the music are in some significant sense non-starters. In other words, they will not be all they might be without that music that is so ingrained in our hearts. However, our purpose here, insofar as we had one, was to do close readings of the texts of the songs themselves. It's kind of interesting, at least I think it is, that Paul McCartney had a very wonderful, I'd say, high school or grammar school experience. He was taught English by a man called Alan Durband, whose name would be even more familiar to readers of this book if I'd mentioned it as many times as he actually mentioned it in the course of our conversations. And Alan Durband had been a scholar. He'd been a student at Cambridge, and one of his professors there was F.R. Leavis. And F.R. Leavis is a name with which many of our listeners will be familiar. He was a person who was deeply interested in the close reading of texts. And Alan Durband inspired Paul McCartney as a teenager to, I think, go deeper into such texts in English literature as he was introducing Paul McCartney.
How did you get involved in this project? I mean, Paul McCartney just didn't call you up on the phone and ask you to do this, did he?
He did not call me on the phone. It was, as I like to describe it when people ask, an arranged marriage. It was a marriage arranged by Robert Weil, who's the editor at the publishers. And Paul McCartney had already done a book with Bob Weil. He'd done Blackbird Singing, some of his poems. I'd done a book for Live Right, which was an introduction to a new edition of The Wasteland, which, of course, had originally been published by Horace Liveright. He bought it at a dinner party the same night as he bought something by James Joyce. And indeed, there was a little bit of that about the way this book started. Bob Weil and I went to the Metropolitan Opera one night in 2015. We went to see Don Carlos by Verdi, a very long opera. And in the course of that evening, he started talking about the possibility of this book with Paul McCartney. And let's put it like this, by the time the evening was over, we had a plan. So that was presented to Paul McCartney and it worked out.
So were you in immediately, or did you have to be persuaded?
Oh, no, I was thrilled to be involved. You know, right the way through his career as a Beatle, of course, and then with Wings and of course, in his solo career, you know, has been a force, I think, in my life, and certainly in the lives of many people who were even vaguely sentient through the 1960s and since. So what's fascinating about his career with the Beatles is that they were, of course, very much off their moment. They were defined by their moment, including, at the risk of sounding a bit banal, the optimism that was associated in the UK with the post-war period. But of course, extraordinarily, they went on to influence their moment also. They came to define their moment. So it was, and to define the rest of us, actually. So it was a very interesting phenomenon. So, yeah, I was thrilled to be involved and continue to be thrilled to be involved.
I can't remember if it was you or I think it was you and not McCartney who wrote in one of the introductions that, the Beatles both reflected and then really drove the culture. And it sort of becomes a little bit hard to untangle all of that because they were so thoroughly integrated in the lyrics and the songs.
Those two were thoroughly integrated, of course. But also, one of the things we must remember about the early 60s in particular, in London, let's say, was that all of the arts were in conversation with one another. Paul McCartney moved, and to some extent the rest of the Beatles, moved in a world, particularly himself actually, in which he was going to plays, he was listening to radio plays, he was fascinated by a whole range of musics, not just the popular music on which he had been brought up. He had what we call, I suppose, an inquiring mind, and continues to have one. But it was a culture in which painters and poets and playwrights and people in fashion were all rubbing shoulders.
How did you collaborate on this book together? I mean, how did you actually do the work? Were you in the same room? How did you divide up the roles? How did this work?
It worked like this. We sat mostly in the same room, usually, though not exclusively, in New York, for most of 5 years. The last year, I guess, was a little bit complicated by COVID-19, so there were a few Zoom meetings at the end, but for the most part, they were in-person meetings, as we say. They were recorded on two microphones, two recording devices, one a backup for the other. They were transcribed, and then they were edited by myself into semi-coherent texts or commentaries on the texts. So they were edited a bit. I mean, everything there, I think, comes from Paul McCartney, but there was a certain amount of moving things around. As you know, as an editor yourself, that's one of the things one does. One of the things with the encouragement of Bob Weil, the great editor, really, who is the person who's most responsible for all of this, was, for example, he encouraged me never to use the same formulation twice at the beginning of a piece. One might say it in 1963, I was sitting in a room wherever. So we did make a point of, what did one say, of making it interesting. And we made a point ourselves, Paul McCartney and myself, as we sat down. We vowed pretty much not to leave the room we were sitting in without his saying something that he hadn't quite said before. Because let's face it, he's been interviewed many times over the years, and he has told, as many of us have who've been interviewed a few times, we tend to tell the same stories.
Was that your suggestion?
Well, it was substantially. And old Bob Weil, I think, was keen on the idea, and he was keen on the idea himself. He wanted this to be a book in which people would be making some discoveries about himself.
I want to say something about the physical shape and size of this book. It's 2 volumes, alphabetical by title of the song, beautifully produced, many photographs and artifacts of actual lyrics written in hand on the page. It smells fantastic. For those who like a really good book glue, this book smells great. I just have to say that. And I'm curious to what extent you had any involvement in terms of determining what the number of songs was going to be, what the songs were, or did that really fall to Paul McCartney?
No, the number of songs really was determined largely by myself, though there were a few occasions, I think, when MPL, which is his company, made a suggestion or two of something I might have overlooked. But it was largely the songs that I thought worked particularly well on the page. People already have, of course, there are theories abounding about every aspect of Paul McCartney's life, including, is it really him? So already the theory has been presented that there are 154 lyrics because there are 154 of Shakespeare's sonnets. Not quite the case. That just happens to be an accident, as it were. One thing I was very keen on, and I'm very glad to see that we were able to follow through on it, was that it would be presented not chronologically, but alphabetically. I must say that's one of my favourite modes for the presentation of material. It allows for even more of a sense of adventure, frankly, as one turns the page, and one's not quite sure from which era, indeed, the song might derive. And one of the things that comes across to me, and I hope to other readers, is that there's a fabulous sense of continuity, a continuum in his work. So it might be a song from 4 or 5 years ago, or it might be a song from 1961. And there's the same sense of adventure, I think, about reading it. It also means, of course, that there is not what, for some readers, I think, might have been a vague sense of the top end of the career being a little top-heavy, as it were, with the Beatles. What I think might be a little bit of an issue for some readers has been avoided with that.
You write in the introduction that you can think of McCartney as a writer of mini plays. What do you mean by that?
One of the things about McCartney's work, and I think actually the work of many songwriters, is that it's, on one hand, it's an extremely visual medium. And he is very, very visual. He is a painter, of course, himself. He's presenting scenes. We often allude to the filmic aspect of a song. But in his case, he was actually very influenced by radio drama on the BBC, and some of it quite arcane. Alfred Jarry, for example, one wouldn't ordinarily think of a rock musician being influenced by Alfred Jarry. And also, he had the opportunity to go to a lot of live theatre, and partly through his relationship with Jane Asher and the extended Asher family, which was very important to him in his early years in London. So he was very into theatre, and he has a very good sense of introducing characters, setting scenes, and introducing a character, leaving the character, introducing another, and then coming back to a scene, let's call it, in which the two combine, in which there is actually some tension, or certainly they come together and there's a denouement of some kind. So yes, in a strange way, probably even more than drama presented on stage. And this is a little difficult for those of us who spend so much of our time in the US, particularly in this era where radio drama is alas not quite to the fore. The extent to which the BBC was an influence on the Beatles cannot be overstated. And for example, they refer to Sgt. Pepper somewhere along the way as a radio play. They were fascinated by sound effects. They used sound effects, which are more often than not associated with radio drama. They used sound effects in many of their songs. So the drama is coming in to play in a number of ways.
Speaking of inspiration across the arts, what did you learn about the process of writing music and lyrics compared with, and I guess Paul McCartney's specific process of writing music and lyrics compared with your own process of writing poetry? Did these feel like these were two similar things, or were there interesting differences?
Well, writing poetry and writing songs are akin but different. In a word or two, very briefly, we could talk about this for a long time. In a word or two, the song lyric requires music, finally, to make it what it most might be. The poem brings its own music, and in fact, it even brings its own conductor with it. It will teach you how to perform it. The poem is aiming towards some notion of perfection, and oddly, the song lyric is very happy to leave something out, to be less than complete, and it will be filled out by that other component, the music itself. But in terms of one very important point of contact, something that Paul McCartney alludes to again and again is the sense that he does not quite know what he's doing. And that's an absolutely vital aspect for me. That's certainly one of my planks I believe in that absolutely. The minute I know what I'm doing, everybody else knows. So he believes in what used to be called inspiration, or some version of it. He believes in his being a vehicle for something beyond himself. He gives himself over to the possibility of what the song might achieve. I haven't seen this new, I'm kind of saving up watching this new documentary. But I mean, I understand from my friends that when I can actually see it, insofar as one can, what would one say, witness such an act of creativity, I believe there's something very akin to that with the Beatles working on Get Back, and one can actually see it coming into being. And, you know, on one hand, there's all the sheer musicianship that they shared and which they developed. You know, they had their craft, which they had worked at very intensively for several years. And that, of course, also comes into play. But what really makes a song great is something bigger than that. And it comes from somewhere we don't quite understand. And at the risk of getting a bit, touchy-feely about it, it comes from somewhere beyond. It visits the songwriter. And I think at its best, the same is true of writing poetry.
Well, let's turn to poetry because you have a new collection out. It's called Howdy Skelp. I'd love to have you read a poem from it. But first, can you just talk a little bit about how this collection came together and what does that title refer to? I love that expression. I'd never heard of it before.
I first came upon this phrase, Howdy Skelp, in a poem by Robert Burns. And the word skelp I was familiar with, being from Northern Ireland. A skelp, we're very influenced by, among other versions of English, we're very influenced by the Scottish dialect, since we're, just across the way from Scotland. So their way of talking has influenced how we all speak in Northern Ireland. So a skelp is a slap in the face in many cases. A howdy is a Scottish term for a midwife. So traditionally, as howdy skelp was what the midwife gave the newborn as it was, getting started in the world, little kickstart into action. So there's a poem in which the phrase is used. So it just, the book itself was written actually very quickly. I mean, perhaps indecently quickly for some people's taste. A lot of it was written during the COVID-19 lockdown era. But actually, just to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, I have no idea where it came from. It came into being by its own volition. It's not that I was absent. It's not that I had nothing whatsoever to do with it. But I think largely I was carried along by what the poems wanted to do. And a case in point would be The Banisters. And it started with something I read, just an image of the fact that during World War I, certainly in the UK, various aspects of household furniture and the bits and pieces of street furniture were repurposed. So that, for example, walnut banisters were repurposed as rifle butts. And it was with that image that I started out on this poem, The Banisters. Our ornamental gates and railings that were melted down for rifle barrels have gained some sort of posthumous renown by unambiguously drawing a line in the sand. The gates and railings are finally taking a firm stand and even more emphatically bringing things to a close. The exit wound is their approximation of a rose or a geranium under gauze on the windowsill. Gangrene, the green and gold of the first full-blown daffodil. Also rendered, so it would even more tellingly rend, was lead stripped from the gutters and flashing. For lead will bend along a spine as it did along a walnut ridge post. What was once an outer sanctum is now the innermost. shouldered as rifle stocks, after a mere 3 weeks of drill, the banisters are gradually taking another hill.
Thank you for that. That was from the new collection, Howdy Skelp. Paul Muldoon is the author of that collection of poetry and also the editor of Paul McCartney's new book, The Lyrics. Paul, such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My colleagues John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what they're reading. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
John, let's start with you. What have you been reading?
Well, I've got an epic to start. I started reading Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I've been meaning to read for many years, obviously, perhaps. And I just thought, well, it's a holiday season. It's a grim holiday season. I'm not going to be socializing a lot. And so I'll tuck into this book. And so I started last weekend and I'm through. I guess it's composed of 8 books, short, 120-page sections, and I'm through the first one. So I have a start under my belt. I'm absolutely loving it. But what happened was through 50 pages or 60 pages, I thought, my God, you expect classics to be at least some percentage intimidating, where it's going to take a while, or some parts are going to be a slog when other parts are going to be delightful. But I just thought, well, I'll read this book in 5 days. The dialogue is very snapping and the descriptions are great. And there's 2 or 3 characters in each other's orbits. But then toward the end of book 1, of course, there's a lot of complications introduced and many more characters suddenly introduced. So now I've got, in addition to Dorothea and Casaubon and their relationship, now I'm learning about the Vinceys and Lydgate, Featherstone, Bulstrode.
Oh, gosh, yes. I forgot about him.
And so I'm remembering that I'm bad with complexity of casts. I'm fine with complexity of like thought and style. I can read a book about one person's mind splintering and breaking down and I kind of get it all. But when you put 7 people in a room and you start pinging around them and saying who's related to who, how, it really takes me some time to settle into that and figure it all out. So I'm a little discombobulated at the moment, but the writing is obviously some of the best I've ever read in anything, and I'm incredibly excited to be on my way in it. I know that, Pamela, you're a huge fan of it.
I am a huge fan, although, you're avoiding the elephant in the room, which is that I did tell you to read Daniel Deronda first, and you ignored me. But I recognize that's a minority opinion. And also, I want to say you haven't actually gotten to the thing that everybody calls the reason you get a little bogged down.
Right.
Middlemarch.
I've
about that?
Sort of, yes. The same way with that.
You'll know it. You'll know it when you see it.
Yes, the same way Anna Karenina has its Longores.
Yeah, it's like, for me, there's a part that's like the battlefield scene of War and Peace, where
right.
at least, I don't know, maybe for some readers that's very exciting. For me, it's like, oh.
No, I tend to suffer a little bit through those things. But I will, before I kick it over to Greg, I will just partially kiss back up to the boss and say that I did order Daniel Deronda first with the intention of taking your advice. And then I thought, so many people know Middlemarch so well that I want to be part of that conversation. But I imagine I'll read much more by her because I do think it's really stunning and I'm loving it.
Yeah, you'll become more the part of the more specialized expert conversation around Daniel Deronda.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Greg, what about you? What are you reading?
Speaking of sucking up to the boss, I'm reading a 2017 novel that I know Pamela read and liked a lot, which went on to win the 2018 Pulitzer for fiction. Do you know what I'm going to say, Pamela?
Less.
Yes, it's Less by Andrew Sean Greer. And it's a comic novel about a hapless, failing novelist who pieces together a round-the-world trip as a way of trying to avoid his broken heart when his casual boyfriend of 9 years marries someone else. You may remember that the last time I was here, I talked about Amor Tolz's novel, A Gentleman in Moscow. And in some ways, this is a really perfect book to follow that one. There's like practically no tonal slippage. They're both effervescent and endlessly charming comedies with rollicking prose and this hopeful outlook. But there are also instructive differences, mainly with the protagonists, because where the Count in A Gentleman in Moscow is this suave and unflappable and supremely capable aristocrat, Arthur Less, the hero of Less, is a neurotic dumpster fire.
That was the original title.
Is flappable a word? He flaps. He's traveling. He goes from San Francisco, where he lives, to New York, and then on to Europe, to Berlin and Italy, and on to Japan. Various itineraries. Eventually, I think, to Morocco. I'm not there yet, but he's booked party in the Sahara where he plans to turn 50 years old. Part of this, he's fleeing his heartbreak, but he's also fleeing encroaching old age and trying to have this one big bash for himself before he hit 50. You know, his itinerary gives Andrew Sean Greer an excuse to become tour guide, but it's this guy kind of fumbling his way through and encountering old lovers along the way. It's one mishap after the next in a way that kind of puts me in mind of somebody like Gary Steingart. It's very charming. And there's a sequel to this book, Less is Lost, that is coming out, I believe, this fall. It's one reason that I wanted to read this was to get ready for the sequel by the time it arrives. Also, frankly, I'm reading it because I found it. Our local town dump has a book swap. Leave a book, grab a book.
Andy, mute this part. Mute this part, Andy, if you're listening. Your book was never found at a book dump.
I frequently, when I'm deaccessioning my shelves, bring them to this swap shop and take a look at what other people have left there from their shelves. And there's really high quality stuff, including often advanced reader copies. So clearly there are people with publishing connections who frequent my dump. And
you only go to the best dumps in town. It's no ordinary dump. It's a literary dump.
It's a decollage dump. I've been saving less because, you know, it sounds so reliably charming and funny that it's almost like I have it behind glass, like break in case of emergency, if I really need something that's going to, you know, put a smile on my face.
Has it made you laugh, Greg, yet?
Oh, it's made me laugh out loud a lot. And I constantly harass my wife reading things out loud. I think you talked about this novel while you were reading it, Pamela, on the podcast, and you read out loud part where he was mistranslating German. He's overconfident in his ability to speak German. And there are just some very funny translation lines. I mean, I think the one I can find most quickly is right at the beginning. The part where he's in Germany is filled with it, but at the beginning, when he's responding to an invitation to teach for a winter semester in Berlin, he says something like,
While you look for that, I will say this. There's another part where he sort of happens upon himself looking in the mirror or seeing himself in the mirror by surprise. And he sort of notices that there's an old uncle, like, I don't know how to say that in German, but uncle with an O, staring at him, you know, and he realizes that it's, in fact, himself that I love. There's just these like little teeny moments.
Here's this from the beginning of the book, accepting the invitation to teach in Germany. And he leads into it. The letter is in German. The university is under the impression Arthur Less is fluent in German. And Arthur Less's publisher, who recommended him, is also under this impression. So is Arthur Less. With God's happiness, he writes back, I accept the pedestal of power, and sends it off with a flush of pleasure.
What are you reading, Pamela? Something funny?
Actually, I did read a book that is not usually talked about as funny, but I found parts of it funny, and I'm going to read one, I think, funny part from it, which is Jonathan Franzen's The Correction. So I have sat out the whole Jonathan Franzen thing. I just sat it out. I was like, I'm just not going to participate. Not really because of any ideological fervor or strong opinion. I just thought, I really need to read a book about a Midwestern family. I would rather read about, Bulgarian unrest or Syrians fleeing political oppression.
There is some Eastern European unrest in the Corrections.
There is. Surprisingly, yes. Actually, those are the parts I liked least.
Me too, by a lot.
That said, it's interesting. So I want to start off by saying I think this is a genius novel. I think he's a brilliant writer. I think a lot of people are super jealous. And I'm just putting it on the table. He's really talented. This is really great. But since you mentioned cutting, or did you? Or did I may have just put that on you, John. I did feel like my inner editor wanted to just like tweeze some little chunks from this book. I feel like it could have been a tighter novel, although I feel that way about so many books. Do you? Do you both feel that way?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, often.
Very often.
And John, you feel that even though you tend to read, I'm not going to reveal your secret, and this is how you read 100 books a year, but you do tend to
102-page books a year.
Yes. You do tend to err toward the slender novel.
But that's one of the reasons why, is because I feel like the fat has been trimmed from them and the author has made it this sort of sparkling thing.
Yes.
But I don't want readers to think I feel that way about Middlemarch, because I don't.
Okay. Did you feel that way about the corrections?
That's a longer conversation. I think what he wanted to do with it, he did, and I thought it was just a bad project to make it as capacious as he did in terms of the pharmaceutical stuff and the Eastern European stuff. I just thought that stuff was, I think he really wanted it in there and it was part of what he was trying to do. I just thought those were the parts that failed.
Interesting. So I thought one other interesting thing, just speaking of beefing up the book, is that, of course, one of the characters, Chip, has this theory that you sort of start off a screenplay with a bunch of stuff that will really put people off the novel. And there's this theory that Franzen did the same thing, kind of gave you a reason not to read, which is, of course, something that David Foster Wallace very deliberately did with Infinite Jest. So I don't know if, that was maybe that's part of like that whole world that just annoys the people who are annoyed by Franzen, which is just like, who the hell do you think you are? Like what kind of bombastic thing is that to do, to basically say like, you must get over this hurdle in order to enjoy my work. All that said, I thought it was pretty great. I feel like there's no point in really summarizing it at this time. I mean, everyone other than me has read it. I often read things way after other people. Like I think I read A Civil Action, like 10 years after, in which everyone just looked at me like, don't you already know what happened?
I read the corrections, I think 6 or 7 years after it came out, which at the time felt like an eternity because of how much people were talking about it.
Right, it's been out for 21 years.
You're making me feel better about that and better about being late to Middlemarch. And of course, Franzen's new trilogy is titled after something in Middlemarch, so we're connecting dots here.
I don't know that I will go on to become a Franzen completist, but I definitely want to read the new book. People who I know who are Franzen super fans, and very quietly do they whisper this because he gets so much grief. That's a whole other subject. They say that this new book is probably his best.
It's funny. I'm such an outlier. I really do like Franzen. I liked the corrections. I liked Freedom. I'm not a completist. I may not have read more than those and Crossroads, but I like Crossroads less than the corrections or Freedom.
Well, Pamela, I think you should read it because I think we need a longer segment sometime on Franzen.
Yeah, we are going to have a side Franzen convo because I also know that Dave Kim is a huge fan. Andrew LaValle is a fan. And so I feel like this needs to be subjected to like 3 hours of analysis and discussion. But instead of that for now, I'll just read this tiny little passage that I think is funny. Chip is in something that I think is Dean and DeLuca. It's not named as Dean and DeLuca, but in my head it's Dean and DeLuca. It's a fancy gourmet grocery shop where, people are competitively picking out cheese. And he has no money, and so he's hidden a piece of fish. He's basically shoplifting a chunk of salmon. And I'll just read a little bit here. Chip was approaching the checkout lanes with 4 plausible items in his basket when he caught sight of a head of hair so new penny bright it could only belong to Eden Procuro, who was, herself, slim and 36 and hectic. Eden's little son, Anthony, was seated on the upper level of a shopping cart with his back to a 4-figure avalanche of shellfish, cheeses, meats, and caviars. Eden was laughing over Anthony and letting him pull on the taupe lapels of her Italian suit and suck on her blouse while, behind his back, she turned the pages of a script that Chip could only pray was not his own. She's an agent. The line-caught Norwegian salmon was soaking through its wrapping, his body heat melting the fats that had given the fillet a degree of rigidity. He wanted to escape the nightmare, but he wasn't prepared to discuss the Academy purple under the current circumstances. That's his screenplay. He veered down a frosty aisle where the gelati came in plain white cartons with small black lettering. A man in a suit was crouching beside a little girl with hair like copper in sunshine. The girl was Eden's daughter, April. The man was Eden's husband, Doug O'Brien. "Chip Lambert, what's happening?" Doug said. There seemed to be no ways but girly ways for Chip to hold his grocery basket while he shook Doug's square hand. I just love that. Great. I just love it all. And it gets worse with the fish. But also, just again, side note, for those who have been in a Dean DeLuca, those little ice cream, those gelato containers with that particular type, right?
That description is great.
So I liked it. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry.
Yeah, let's not turn Franzen into an underdog quite yet.
you know what? I think it's time to turn him into an underdog. We can make that part of our 3-hour-long Jonathan Franzen analysis discussion podcast, our side podcast.
Really looking forward to that one, I have to say.
Yeah, Pedro, bonus episode coming up next year, 2022. All right, let's run down the titles of the books we read.
I'm reading Middlemarch by George Eliot.
I'm reading Less by Andrew Sean Greer.
And I read The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.